I think without Dr. Sabriya, this event doesn't happen. She has very kindly facilitated this fantastic space for us. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining who IndieBio are because she's got a much better job than me. But yeah, thank you so much to Dr. Sabriya, and welcome to the stage, please.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming to my office today. So when Owen first asked me to be a part of this, I was just commenting. I was like, okay, so what do we do? And like a true scientist, I made a presentation. Because he was like, you can talk about whatever you would like. And I don't know that I would be as articulate without slides. So if you will indulge me, I will try to keep this to 20 minutes. But when thinking about what I thought I could offer to this discussion and this conversation around diversity in venture, but also how to create more inclusive spaces for individuals in the life sciences, it reminded me that about 2 years ago, I kind of gave a similar presentation to a group of individuals who were building in the biomaterial space about this idea of what does it actually look like to build with care, to think about how to create a community with intentionality and with thoughtfulness. And so I thought that I would share some of that today, in addition to sharing some bits and pieces about what we do here at IndieBio and SOSV. But maybe before I start, I will just, again, welcome you to our space. So SOSV is a venture capital fund. We want to and like to invest in companies at the earliest stages. So I'm always looking for founders or individuals who are using science and biology to solve some of the biggest challenges in our world. Okay, so what do we talk about when we talk about diversity? A lot of times it's, really nice data, it's graphs, it's numbers. I will show you some of those. But I like to also think about what do we not talk about. And I think what we don't talk about is that sometimes just because you have a diverse community doesn't mean you have an equitable one. It also doesn't mean that you have an inclusive one. And so I think that what I would like to share with you is kind of how I think about, let's just say you do have a diverse community, let's say you do have a diverse network, what do you actually then do with that? How do you actually think about working with those individuals to make sure you are building a space, to building an environment that people actually want to show up to and come back to? And so I like to think about it like a garden, right? It's not enough to plant the seeds. It's not enough to say, I want this thing to happen, right? You don't just put a seed in the ground, put some soil on it, and you walk away and you hope, right? You wish, you manifest that a tree or a garden will come, right? You need to water it, you need to check on it, you need to take the weeds out. And so this is kind of how I think about building community, right? Because if you don't cultivate and if you don't sustain it, if you don't build the right environment for their growth, you don't get anything. And so what does it take for a community to grow? And I don't think about it just about growing, but I think, what does it take for a community to actually thrive? So then you might be thinking, okay, well, how are we defining community? And I think if you look at kind of a textbook definition of community as a bunch of people, maybe it's in a room, maybe they come to the same room or the same space often. But I found this quote of someone who defined community in a way that really spoke to me as a scientist. They said that it's by Jennifer Sampson. She is the CEO and president of the United Way for Metropolitan Dallas, and she said a community is a living organism. It is either declining or improving, and that there's no steady state in a community. And I think that if you think about a community as a living organism, it's easier then to understand that you need to take care of it, that you need to show up for it, that you need to monitor it, that you need to check on it. And so I think cultivating a community that works with members and not just for them. So what does that actually look like? It looks like getting specific on who is in your community, why you are building that community, and how you are doing it. I think a lot of times people, and I will maybe give our fund as an example, we throw a lot of events. We've had over 1,000 events in this space, right, where you are sitting. And I remember when I first joined, there was the word community was thrown around. It really was. It was like, oh, we're a community, we're building a community. Lots of people do this. But whenever you ask them, well, who is in your community? Blank stares. Who keeps showing up? Oh, I'm not sure. And so again, I think however big or small your community is, getting really specific on why you're building that community and who is in it is really, really important at those early stages. As is focusing on what your community needs, right? Like, why are you building this community? Why are you bringing these individuals together? Because again, you really have to think, these people are giving up their time, right? They are looking for something. They are coming to this space or to this event or to this network for a thing. Which leads me to the next part, which is instead of a push, creating a pull, right? Why are people coming into this community? What are they looking for? And again, I probably feel like I'm already repeating myself, but I just think really checking in with the people you are building your community with and for to understand what their needs are helps that cultivation and helps that connectivity and helps that sustainability. Right, so how do you then sustain the community once you've built it, once you've got enough people in the room? How do you continue to build it that's based on trust and also supports their growth? I think you need to start paying attention to who keeps showing up time and time again. I think you need to be able to find your advocates within that community and within that network and be willing to co-create with them. And I think you also need to be able to ask the questions. Why are you showing up? Is this working? But also be willing to listen to those answers and actually do something with that information. I'm sure many of you have joined networks or communities or groups. You've realized, I wish that they'd done this. Maybe you've offered that as feedback, and then what has happened? Nothing. So then you feel, okay, well, I'm not listening to me, so now I've got to go try to find another community, another group. Or maybe I actually don't even want to try. I'm tired, right? So I just think that the asking, the listening, the talking amongst the members is really important, but also the reiterating. Once you're getting that feedback, once you're hearing what people are wanting and are needing, actually doing something about that. And so, I've got a few quotes in this presentation, if you can't tell. This is something else that I think is really important, that it's from a book by Adrienne Marie Brown called Emergent Strategy, and the quote says, "What we pay attention to grows." And so when I first joined this fund, I thought about like, what is it that we pay attention to? What are we trying to grow? What are we trying to expand? And as I said in the beginning, our fund really focuses on founders who are using science and engineering to solve some of the world's biggest problems. We cast a really wide net. We look everywhere. I'm a firm believer that good ideas, good founders, good companies can and should come from anywhere, not just Ivy League schools, not just very wealthy neighborhoods. Because what ends up happening when you cast a wide net, not just for founders, but you get a whole host of diverse problems that they are solving for. So then you get diverse solutions, and that helps drive successful innovation. So these numbers actually might be a little off, but last I checked, to date, we've invested in over 400 companies. This is all, by the way, self-reported data, but we've invested in over 400 companies, 84 countries that our founders are from, 56 countries that they're operating in. Sorry, this is a repeat. I feel like this should be a different number, but 34% of those founders are female and 44% of those founders have PhDs. I also remember a conversation I was having, and I mentioned this to Ellen when we were doing our podcast recording yesterday. I was talking to another investor, and he was saying like, "Oh, you guys have a lot of female founders. That's like really great. I really appreciate that. You know, what's kind of the limit? Like, how many female founders would you like to see?" And the question kind of took me back, because I don't think it was a negative question at all, but my response was like, well, there is no limit. I want to see them all. You know, this number should always be growing. And I think that oftentimes that can happen with people when they're looking at when do we hit our diversity metrics, right? Like once you hit a certain number, that means you should stop trying, or that you should stop casting that wide net. And so for us, and at least part of where I feel responsible for my job is making sure that not only are we widening our application pool, but that we are actually making sure that if we are looking at applicants and we're seeing a large number of founders or a large number of organizations only from like one area, really saying like, well, how come we're not seeing more companies from Atlanta? How come we're not seeing more founders from Texas? How come we're not seeing more folks from Maryland or from Virginia? But again, I just feel like it shouldn't just be the Yales and the Columbias and the Stanfords that are kind of getting the highlights or getting the money. We really should be really thoughtful and intentional about, like I said, where we are sourcing our companies from. And so I think a lot of times people will then also say, well, what can I do, right? I'm just one person and it doesn't feel like I can do that much. And the answer is, as one person, you can absolutely do a lot. But again, if you are in community, the question then becomes, what can we do? And if enough communities ask that question, if enough people come together and say that, then it does become this kind of ripple effect of what can happen and how much the more people that we can bring into these conversations. And so one thing that I thought it would be helpful to highlight is what has New York done, right? So the topic of this kind of whole day is diversity in life sciences, creating a more inclusive future for life sciences. And so one of the things that New York has done and has put kind of money and power behind is creating this organization called the Venture Access Alliance. So apologies, this is a lot of text, but I encourage you all to kind of go and look at this organization. SOSV is one of the founding members of it. It is a coalition of over, I think 72 at this point, investors in New York City that have kind of made a commitment to increasing diversity, not just by the numbers, right, but also through mentorship, also through training programs, so that more people have a chance to understand what it even means to be an investor. I think you did a really great job of pointing out, in science, it's like, okay, you can be a medical doctor, you can be a nurse, you can run a lab. I think a lot of people don't see themselves as investors or even think that they have the capacity to do that. I know I didn't. When I was first offered this job, I almost didn't take it. I have a PhD in microbiology. I have some experience working in higher education, building master's programs. I have worked as an operations director for a small biotech company. So if you looked at kind of my background on paper, you wouldn't necessarily think my next role would be at a venture capital fund. And I know I didn't. One of the reasons that I really appreciated joining the fund that I'm at now is because we do get to work with those founders at the earliest stage. One of my roles is to really help them de-risk the biology that's part of the company, so I can kind of bring my scientific know-how to bear there. But when I realized I would be an investor, it was very like, no thank you. I know investors, I know people in venture capital, I don't want to be associated with that network. But what I'm realizing, and when I kind of took a leap of faith and a bet on myself, is that the face of venture capital is definitely changing. Who gets to write the checks is changing, slowly but surely. And also, it does feel like the voice and the expertise and the perspective and point of view I have on things matters when it comes to looking at companies, when it comes to speaking to founders, but also when it comes to championing some of those companies in the rooms that they themselves cannot get into. So the Venture Access Alliance has three core goals, right? Building community, tracking diversity, and then committing to action. It was written up in TechCrunch, so I think it's been going for about 2 years now. And I wanted to just highlight very quickly, it says, despite what numbers might show, some venture capitalists are quite serious in a commitment toward diversity, equity, inclusion. They're not going away. One of the reasons Venture Access Alliance, I think, has been able to be as powerful and impactful as it is because it's supported by the New York City Economic Development Corporation. So for those of you who don't know, there's two kind of governing bodies. There's the Empire State Development, which does a lot of stuff in the state, and then EDC, which does a lot of stuff for the city, and then kind of together, they work to host a whole bunch of initiatives as it supports kind of economic growth across the city and the state, not just for the life sciences. So I think because we have the backing of this organization, I think people actually took us seriously. They didn't sort of see us as this like ragtag group of investors coming together. There was a little bit of money put into it. There was, announcements. There was support, and I think that there was also accountability because, as I'm sure some of you have been aware and have been a part of, it's great to be part of an initiative. There's a ticker tape parade. There's the press release, and then what happens afterwards? No other support. Everyone kind of keeps moving on. But 2 years later, the Venture Access Alliance is still going strong. We're still always looking for numbers. And one of the things that, if I remember the slides correctly, one of the things that they put out recently, I think last year, was the kind of diversity report for venture capital in New York City. So before showing you some of those statistics, I thought it would be helpful to remind people that the numbers are bad right now, which is that, even though white men represent just 38.1% of the US population, they oversee more than 98% of venture capital assets, which boggles my mind. But here in New York, female co-founded companies in New York receive 19% of VC funding, while Black and Latinx co-founded companies in New York just received just 2.9% of that funding. And according to PitchBook and Crunchbase, this data shows that 17.8% are women investment decision makers and only 1.2% are Black investment decision makers. So I'm a partner at the fund, which means I get to make those investment decisions, and I also have a PhD. So I don't know what the statistic is now, I think like 4% of Black women in the US have a PhD. So by all accounts, I actually shouldn't be standing on this stage talking to you about this, and yet, hi, I am here. And so, when I was pulling together these numbers, I think what can be challenging, especially for me, who's kind of living this every day, it doesn't, because I'm doing it, it doesn't feel as dismal as these numbers would show, but I think oftentimes when I kind of take a step back, I'm just like, oh yeah, because I am often the only, not just, Black woman, but woman in the room, or oftentimes when I'm pushing investments forward or talking about problems that exist for women, sometimes there's a little bit, not necessarily more pushback, but I have to give more evidence. I have to bring more data to bear to get people to take me seriously. And so what I would just like to show quickly is some of the data that the Venture Access Alliance was able to pull about our grouping here in New York. So remember, this is 72 venture capital firms took this survey. Of those 72, 29% of them are underrepresented minority-led. 32% of them have a very specific diversity thesis. Many funds don't. And 44% of them are women-led, which means that they have a managing partner at the helm. Okay. If we look at the composition of these portfolio companies compared to the national venture data, you can see that New York is actually doing pretty okay. Our member portfolios reflect greater racial diversity than the national average across all US VC firms. And our portfolio companies our firms are also more likely to invest in companies and founders that identify in a diverse network. Again, then if you look at the gender breakdown of this, women of color are still starkly underrepresented. I think what that also shows is probably if you maybe do 2 clicks below that, the question could also become, well, why aren't more women or why aren't more Black women or underrepresented minorities starting companies? I think that that's something Marcus and I were talking about, and maybe something we can touch on during the Q&A, but I think for a lot of underrepresented minorities or for groups that fall into that, they often don't even think that they can start companies. They aren't often given the tools, the technologies, or really even the language to understand, even though oftentimes when you go and you talk to them, they have a business idea, but they don't even understand the language around customer discovery. They don't understand things. When I say understand, it's more that they just haven't used it in that framework of like unit economics or of, oh, I can make this an LLC, I can file this as a Delaware C corp, I can get a patent around this, I can make a business. And so one of the things that also came out of this report is, oh wait, yes, yeah, yes, hold on. No, sorry, that one shouldn't have been in there, apologies. What came, recommendations. Okay, so we have these numbers, and by the way, that report actually has a lot more graphs. I didn't kind of want to go too much into statistics and numbers. But I recommend, if it is of interest to you, to read it. There's also another report that the EDC put out, kind of in corollary to that looks at venture capital or diversity in venture capital, both in New York but more broadly, versus just the Venture Access Alliance one was just the ones who are part of that organization. And so I cobbled together recommendations and best practices from both of those reports. So if we're thinking about how do we increase portfolio diversification, invest in diverse founders. It really is, or can be, just that easy. Really, like I said at the beginning, kind of casting a wider net, making sure you are also understanding where your blind spots. Like if you're only seeing founders or companies from a certain geographic region or a certain school, that is a time for you to say, well, why is that? What other connections, what other schools do I need to be reaching out to? Where do I need to be going, right? Like actually leaving New York, we travel quite often to different ecosystems because there is something to be said for meeting people physically where they are at, speaking to them and talking to them. So, the first one, invest in diverse founders, but also target later stage support for underrepresented founders. Oftentimes, underrepresented founders can, get that first check. They can get that little bit of capital to kind of get their companies going. But then at the later stage, whether that's the seed or the Series A, oftentimes when they're looking for mentorship, when they're looking for support, who, where, nowhere. So I think, pushing some of these later stage funds, again, to do the same thing that I said before, which is casting wider nets, and really making sure that they are looking for things that they don't normally invest in. Take a new approach to evaluating companies. I'm sure maybe many of you have heard that venture capital can be a lot of pattern matching, which is like invest in like. And so, again, it also takes a lot of self-awareness to know this for yourself. And so, if you are realizing, like, I'm seeing the kind of same thing, I'm investing in the same thing, kind of going back to, like, what are those metrics that you're using to evaluate companies? Maybe those need to be shifted around. I think, and both addressing funding and not equity. So there is data out there, and apologies that I can't remember it off the top of my head, but there is data out there that shows that women-led companies, underrepresented minority companies, they get less funding than their white male or just white counterparts. So why is that? Is that because people aren't taking bigger bets on founders that don't look like them? Is it that they don't see that the problem is as big as they think it is because it doesn't personally impact them? So again, really kind of coming to the table, as they say, and asking the hard questions about if your portfolio isn't diverse, why is that? And I do think, again, continuous monitoring and reporting. As a scientist, data is king, and a lot of funds, and frankly, people who want to give people money, unless you show them data, they think it's all anecdotal. They're like, oh, that's not really our fund, or that I'm sure people have shared anecdotes, and sometimes I'm like, oh, that's never happened to me. I'm a big fan of quantitative data, but I'm also of the mind that we need qualitative data as well. Something that I mentioned earlier, which is that, what do we not talk about when we talk about diversity, is that diversity can often feel like a very easy and quantifiable metric, right? It's a numbers game. I just showed you graphs on that, but if you were to ask someone, how do you measure inclusion, what would that graph look like? What are you actually asking people to tell you about? And so I think it is really important to understand not just what you are measuring, but how you are measuring it. And then again, once you see those numbers, what then is your protocol for changing those? Okay, and then so at the decision, so if we think about, okay, well, how does a fund potentially think about diversifying their portfolio? How do we then think about diversifying who gets to make those decisions? At a fund level, you can think about investing or co-investing with small, diverse, and emerging managers. And also really thinking about how to establish systems so that you can train to remove bias from hiring processes. Again, this goes back to the like, invest in like, oftentimes like, high risk like, right? I'm sure we've all heard the stories of people getting jobs at the golf course or kind of in places that, maybe might not normally be at, but I personally don't like golfing, but again, it's just how do you make sure that you are having an equitable hiring process so that you are actually picking the best of the best. Also to provide mentorship programs and also to hire diverse interns. But again, I just want to come back to what I was saying before too. It's like not just enough to hire diverse people. You also have to make sure that you are checking in with those individuals that you're hiring and your whole team to make sure that you're also creating both an equitable and inclusive environment. Because it is important, but also, again, another quote. I came across this quote when I was reading, actually it was a New Yorker article by this woman, her name is Eileen Pollack. It's called The Only Woman in the Room. And she says we need women and minorities to enjoy an ambient sense of belonging in those professions, and the professions she was talking about was a scientist. If the future they create is going to be one in which all of us feel at home. And I don't know that I have cracked this at all. I know organizations are working on it. I don't know how you measure inclusion. I don't know how you measure whether or not the environment or the workplace that you have created feels welcoming. I laugh because Marcus is in this room, and it's something that him and I probably chatted about for over a decade at this point. And again, I know people, for example, I was talking to someone about this before, and they said, oh, well, that's easy, you just measure retention. How long are they staying at a job? Okay, but let me tell you, I've stayed at jobs that I hated because I had to pay rent, I had to live in this world. So I don't know that if that is necessarily the right metric. I know it is a metric. So I still think that we are figuring that out, but I often think of this quote because it is true that if the people who are going to be building the future need to look like the people who are in the present, and we're not doing a good enough job making them feel welcome, we're kind of screwed. But I also always love to show this picture because this is, when I think about what it takes to create an inclusive environment, I kind of had to do it for myself in grad school. So these are some of my closest friends when I felt like I was a wee baby in graduate school. So this gentleman, these three gentlemen all have their MD PhDs. She has her PhD, she works at Johnson & Johnson right now, and so I imagine this is a picture that might make some people bristle, especially if you say these are well-educated, hold multi-degrees, work in hospitals, work in large organizations. And so for me, I had to create the inclusivity that I felt like my grad school wasn't offering at the time by myself. And what I will then also leave you with is, surprise, one last quote from a book that I actually reread last year by Octavia Butler called Parallel the Sower. Maybe some of you have read it or know it. And I think that this is an important one as we think about not just diversity in the life sciences, but diversity in all of our workplaces and kind of the world, that nothing is going to save us if we don't save ourselves, we're dead. She says, now use your imagination. And I think that one of the things that venture capital and many organizations and industries lack is imagination. I think it feels a bit devoid of creativity in how we are going to solve some of these problems, both from a human and planetary health side, but also from the standpoint of creating diverse and inclusive environments. I think that people are unwilling often to go outside of their comfort zones when it comes to thinking about who has the right to be a scientist, to be an investor, to be a doctor. And I think that given the way that our world is, we actually don't have the luxury of not being creative and not using our imagination. So I will leave you with that because I feel like I will go on a tangent and I'm going to save that for the Q&A. Thank you.